A very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. I'm here with Courttia Newland. He's an anthologist, a novelist, a screenwriter, playwright, educator, and at times an activist. Having unsettled the conventions of crime fiction in books like The Scholar, Society Within, Snakeskin, The Dying Wish, he turns his hand to speculative fiction in his latest novel, A River Called Time, which envisages an alternative London devastated by war and climate change and divided into a wealthy inner city and a poverty-stricken outer city. It's a very apt novel for a burning world. As we record this, after the murder of George Floyd, there's been a resurgence in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and in the UK, and an associated challenge to the publishing world to represent and pay and promote Black and other minority ethnic writers as they should be, including as writers and not just Black writers. Courttia, how have you been thinking, feeling, and responding to all these events?
That's such a big question because it's so complicated and complex. The ways in which you respond. You respond as a writer, you respond just as a person, you respond as a Black man, and those are all kind of intersecting, obviously, but sometimes can be very different. I suppose just as a starting from the most obvious position as a Black man, it's painful. It's really painful. I think you saw John Boyega's tears. Those tears are very real for most of us, and I think for such a long time this has been happening, and we've had to endure this. And then I think the fact that it's happened during a pandemic, and when the world is in so much trouble, everywhere you look, it's really heartbreaking. And I think sometimes just having to have that focus, having that focus of being in your house, and not being distracted by normal daily life, has made things like a little bit more acute for everybody, I think, but particularly if you're Black, and to see a Black man die like that, it's horrifying. I mean, personally, I haven't watched the video. That's as bad as it is for me. I can't watch the video. I saw the picture, and that was traumatizing enough for me. I still haven't watched it yet. As a writer, um, I haven't yet come to terms with it. I've been revisiting work that I did before that was talking about this subject matter. I've written about it in plays. I've written a short story about it. I'm constantly talking about this. And so I haven't written any fresh work concerning this because I think it's a little bit too raw for me. But I know it will come at some stage. And as a human being, you just feel a real sense of like injustice. A real weighty sense of injustice, but also a sense that maybe a shift is coming. As the statues fall, and as you look out at the protests and you see different people protesting, whether that's because of age or that's because of race, different people feeling outraged, and there is a sense of, okay, I'm quite cynical, but I think that maybe there is a little bit of hope there. Maybe things have moved forward a step from where they were before the last time this happened.
You mentioned the statues going down. We have here a question from filmmaker Sue Carpenter in South London. She asks, are there any particular statues that you would like taken down or erected?
I mean, there's a petition going out that I saw this morning that said Alada Equiano should be erected on West India Quay. Because I can't remember what the name of the statue that was there before, but that gentleman had been taken down because of his links to the slave trade. And I think Equiano going up would be a great one. Ignatius Sancho should go up. Mary Prince should definitely go up. It's strange because a lot of the time in London, and it's funny, I talk about this in River, I look down a lot. I don't want to see those faces. They are quite oppressive to you to know that, without even knowing the history, to know who's regularly venerated, to know that philanthropy in a certain time period is usually linked to the slave trade, means that I don't look at the statues and in order to gauge who they are, it's just so oppressive. So you tend to walk London and other cities, European cities, American cities, with your head down a lot of the time. You don't want to look into those spaces. You don't want to see those people. But I definitely, there's so many, the famous people like Equiano and Mary Prince, but also, the people who, aren't so well known. There are places, say in Bristol, called Black Boy Lane, after a unnamed black slave that died in a pub, and maybe statues erected to those people as well, in order to commemorate them and give them some kind of a legacy.
That's so interesting. The black person's experience of the built environment, the named environment, the lived environment, and actually having to look into the eyes of people who are celebrated for having done unspeakable things to people like yourself helps perhaps others to understand why these demands are real.
Yeah, I mean, sorry to cut you, but just thinking as you were talking, just thinking about the fact that when I grew up next door to the White City Estate, and on the White City Estate, which is populated by a very multicultural community, but loads of African people and Caribbean people. In the middle of the estate is the General Smuts pub, and that was strange. When I suddenly did some research and found out who this person was, and I think he'd been a general. I think in the Boer War in South Africa, killed a great many people, and so those kind of things, just pop into your head as you're talking. I'm thinking, okay, yeah, there was General Smuts, people like that.
What do you make of you're very active in Twitter in the last few weeks, but largely retweeting others, not necessarily making many statements of your own, although you did co-sign a statement by your fellow writer Dorothy Cumson on the gauntlet that you were jointly throwing down to the publishing industry. What do you make of the conversation in the last few weeks in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, both in the US and in the UK? And what's been your own engagement with it? What's characterized your own engagement with it?
I mean, for me, this is an ongoing engagement. Because I mean, I think anyone who knows me knows I've been talking about this stuff for a very long time. I mean, probably ever since I stepped into the industry, I started, looking around and seeing who was around me and noticing very few people like myself, and trying to at first uh, be vocal about that, and then secondly do something about that. So whether that was creatively, like I don't know if I can show you, but we produced this book, Icy Free, the Penguin Book of New Black Writing in Britain in 2000, and that was pushing like something like 93 writers, black writers, a lot of who were really well known, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Buchi Macheta, and Lem Sisse, and alongside people who were less well known. And so I did that in 2000 with Khadija George. We were co-editors. And that was published by Hamish Hamilton, Simon Prosser. And we've just, met up recently the other day to celebrate 20 years of that. So sometimes the stand I took was just to push writers and to try and get them more attention. And other times it was behind the scenes, working with literary agencies like Spread the Word, to put together the Writing the Future report. I was part of a steering committee that did that. Holding events like No Room at the Table with English Pen. I suppose my literary, because I don't call myself an activist, I'm not a political activist. I might say I'm a literary activist, but my activism has taken the form of trying to champion writers, push writers, and also push for more inclusion within the industry as well.
Tell us about, sorry, incidentally, IC3, landmark anthology, and you've given us a hint at why, and a great piece of work by Simon Prosser there. Many of its writers will be appearing on the Lockdown LitFest, so look forward to Lem Sisse soon, for example. IC3, landmark of anthology, and you're a very considerable short story writer. I find your short stories incredibly powerful, and one that really stings in this moment is Reversible. It's a furious and righteous and incisive work of prose poetry, really, published in 2012. What was that about? What prompted it? Tell us more about it, and how did it get published?
Yeah.
What did it represent for you and the world at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote Reversible in a fit of rage. A lot of my writing comes out of that, I think, sometimes. I just published a novel called The Gospel According to Cain, which was published in America first, but then was published over here by Telegram, at imprint of Saki. And it was really great to work with those guys. But I felt like the response or lack of response to the book was really disarming. I was trying to write about young people and our disconnect as a society with our young people, the younger generation, the dissatisfaction that I felt that they were feeling, and the fact that they were left behind, particularly working class young people. And I wanted to write this book as an allegory for that. So basically, the book is about a woman whose son is kidnapped from her. He's taken from her when he's 8 months old, which is based on a true story. And she loses her son. He's taken from a parked car, and he's never seen again. And then 20 years later, a kid appears at her front door, knocking on the door, saying he's her lost son and he's come back to her. And so I was using that as an allegory for the estrangement that we feel from our young people, the younger generation, as adults. You know, we love them when they're kids and they're young and they're cute and stuff, and they go off and become teenagers. And then sometimes, particularly with working class kids, they come back and we don't recognize them as men, and we fear them, you know, and we vilify them. And so I was using that that subject matter to talk about that, and also using stories from the Black British community that have been forgotten or are largely unknown. And because this was a Black woman that this has happened to, really, or a Black couple. And then what happened after that was that I'd finished the book in June, July 2011. And then in August, the riots happened. And at that point in time, I knew that that book would be a hard sell. At that point in time, nobody wanted to listen to the points of view of young people. People were saying that the riot that happened in 2011, which was prompted by the killing of Mark Duggan by the police, the riots that had happened afterwards were about consumerism. They're about trainers. They're about wanting to loot, and they weren't political in nature. And I knew that that wasn't the case. I knew that people were really, really angry about the police overstepping the mark, as they saw it, and the police lying about Mark Duggan firing at them when he hadn't actually fired at them at all. It was the police who had fired at each other. Things like that, you know, that he'd thrown a gun that they never found. So when these things came up, people got more and more upset, and the police weren't communicating with them in Tottenham, and then it led to anger, you know. And this wasn't the first time this had happened, obviously, in Tottenham and under Broadwater Farm Estate. So what happened to the book was that it just got, I couldn't get it out. No one wanted to touch it, really. And then I ended up getting it published in the States first by Akashic Books. They picked it up and they put it out there. And then I got a deal in the UK. And I was angry and frustrated at that. And so after the lack of response, you know, very little reviews. I must have got 2 or 3 reviews for that book. No interviews about that book. I was just upset at what I felt was the Black British voice not being heard. And I wrote Reversible. I'm just going to write this piece and I'm going to write about what happened. I'm going to write about Mark Duggan, but I'm going to fictionalize his story because this is a common story. I've lost friends to the police, and I'm going to humanize his story as well. And instead of making him the victim, I'm going to take you to the place where he started from, where he was a human being, and he wasn't just a statistic or a gangster.
That's very interesting. You said that after the police killing of Mark Duggan and the protests and riots that ensued, you found it more difficult to get a piece like Reversible published and to get your work that addresses these things published. This time around, after George Floyd, um, the publishing industry seems to be responding a lot better and taking things seriously. Do you see that there's a difference this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I think what surprised me has been the statements, the outpouring of statements saying that yes, we recognise that there is a problem. I mean, the Black Writers Guild penned an open letter following Dorothy Coonson's open letter, which many of us signed. I signed, and we've had a really positive response to that letter. So I think, yeah, this is new. This is all fresh territory. I mean, we've heard it individually from people, and I've heard it when I speak to people. When I go into those publishing houses and I talk to people, people are very, very aware of the problem and have been for a long time. People are like, how do we fix this? And now I think there's a sense of, okay, they're willing to listen to us saying, these are the things that you can do which will help to implement some kind of change, whether on the micro or the macro. We've been here a long time, you know. When the Black Writers Guild met, there was Margaret Busby, there as well. And Margaret Busby, obviously, we didn't meet; we met virtually, but Margaret Busby was there, and Margaret Busby has a wealth of experience in the industry. Obviously, she was part of Allison and Busby publishing group, and yeah, she's just got huge amount of experience in the industry. There's very many people there as well, and collectively, I don't know, it might have been like 200 years of experience if you added it all together, in the industry. And people have seen these things come and go. I myself, 20 years in the industry, have seen things come and go, promises made and broken. We've never quite found that fix. And so I think I have a bit of like wary cynicism to what's actually going to happen. And I also feel like there's a lot that we can do ourselves, just with the collective experience that we have. There's a lot that we can go out there and implement right now. So I'm pretty much concerned with that stuff for now, getting on with the stuff that I was doing anyway. I ran a project called Our Messy League, which was funded by the Arts Council, and we mentored writers, 6 writers over a year. Every month, I taught classes to specifically Black and Asian writers, people of any ethnicity, really, but they could come to this text, and we studied race and class mainly, and also just how to develop craft. And so these are the things that I have been doing and will continue to do, until it's my time to leave, basically.
Uh, Courttia recently said in an interview with The Guardian, an article for The Guardian, I had to submit to being exoticized by white women. If I didn't, I was punished. And this relates to something that your agent, a landmark figure in the industry, Crystal Mehay Morgan, wrote recently about Black writers being exoticized and sort of not being allowed to function as writers, but having to be Black writers, having to bleed on the page, and so on, in order to get their stories published. Are you conscious of that yourself? And is it one of the demands that you want to see dealt with now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all very conscious of that. That usually when we're asked to speak, we're being asked to speak about race, and like today, we spoke about that. We discussed that whether it be okay to speak about race, and I was like, yeah, sure. In this current climate, I think we must. But sometimes we don't want to speak about race, or we don't want to be, you know, we don't want to say, okay, can I write an article that's just about, Father's Day and smoking, for example, going back into my reservoir of experiences, and people saying, no, we're not interested in that. We're interested in your views about Black community, or you should only write working class stories, otherwise we're not interested. So yeah, we just want to express the range of our experiences and our interests as well. So we're exoticized in a lot of ways. I mean, sometimes it's sexually, sometimes it's economically, sometimes we're just exoticized for our skin color and our race, and culturally, we're exoticized because of that. And I think that for me, a level playing field and also a huge change would be us being able, I'm talking about as human beings and as writers, to be ourselves, to bring ourselves to the table. I mean, I know not bringing our whole selves to the table is not always possible for all sorts of reasons. You go to work as anyone, you go to work, you can't just be completely yourself. We understand that. But being able to represent ourselves culturally, particularly in an artistic way, would be great. So if I want to write a book about race, brilliant. If I don't want to write a book about race, then that should be brilliant too. People are always asking Black people, why do you always make it all about race? And we don't actually. We don't. It's not us making it about race. It was made about race when people went to Africa and they enslaved human beings and they started to define us as white and Black. That didn't come from Black people. That came from Europeans.
And so to return to you as a writer and your own literary development and the development of your career, tell us about River
Yeah,
and its genesis, its 18-year genesis.
yeah, 18 years, yeah. So I started River in 2002, around the time that I just finished Snakeskin, actually. And I wanted to write a book that was set in an alternative world where slavery didn't happen. So because slavery didn't happen in this alternative world, colonization didn't happen either. None of those things happened. African cosmology has become the dominant religion, and people generally don't see things in terms of race. That dynamic that I was just talking about, that started with slavery and became a legal definition, just hasn't happened at all. And Europeans did encounter Africans and people from around the world, but basically, instead of enslaving them, instead of vilifying their beliefs and stuff, they went with it, just like say the Greeks did when they went to Egypt originally. They just said, okay, so how can we learn more about these things? Obviously you've done some good things and you have a civilization. How do we buy into it? And that's the trajectory that this alternate world has taken. So things like out of body experiences, astral projection, ancestor veneration, all of those things are just normal. They just happen. So there's been technological leaps because of this. There has been a war between secularists and spiritualists, and the secularists were defeated, and that has resulted in a huge bomb that was dropped in the middle of London, inner city London. So where we have inner city London now, it's just wasteland, and there's a huge building in the middle of it called the Ark, and all the rich live there. Well, not all the rich, but if you're rich, you can pay to live in this place. And if you're poor, you live in outer city where the radiation is and where pollution is and high levels of poverty and degradation and lack of education, all of those things. So it's not a perfect world. I'm not. It's still a dystopian world rather than a utopian world, but it's drawn on the lines of class rather than being drawn on the lines of race.
It is so rich in speculative detail and in detail that reflects where we are, but in through a glass. Uh, and we can't spoil too much, but there is a whole section about sort of contemporary London, which is not quite contemporary London. Uh, tell us. Well, actually, give us. Why don't you give us a reading now? Give us a reading from it now.
Yeah, I'd love to. Just going to pause to drink.
Good idea.
Right, or should I just do it all in one? So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, where the main character, Marcus Denny, who is 8 years old at this stage, has met up with his friends, and they are biking around a derelict Ark station. The building in the center of the city where all the rich people live is called the Ark. There are Ark stations that they're like miniature malls where people can get on the train and then go into the Ark. But this has been derelict for a long time. The Ark was built in this alternative world in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, and so we're now in present day, but in that parallel. So it's 2020. So it's been a very old building by then, and a lot of these stations have fallen into disrepair. That evening, he played World Cup outside with his brother, while the filthy sun descended, casting dust like a curse. As Ninka was only 5, he couldn't play to the best of his ability, though Marcus still enjoyed the game. Their street was a discrete series of red brick houses, one backed against another like Siamese twins. His brother was born on the living room floor, his mother's moans climbing the stairs to his pod room, where he'd been banished to await Ninka's arrival. Marcus himself had been born in the local hospital after his mother's waters broke, and he never arrived. When he was bontoozed into the world some 18 hours later, his parents had lived in the house for less than a year. Chasing the ball, running, he had an abrupt vision of a sleeping face lit by restless candlelight, eyes cast heavenwards, blind, more flickering lights, larger than the candles, the ancient stutter of a cinema reel projected onto the blank screen of their eyes. He saw himself, his mother and father, stood to attention beneath the wailing screech of gears, the everlasting blast of a train horn. Unknowing, Marcus was being granted his second premonition.
That's extraordinary. And tell us about that in context of the rest of the book.
Yeah,
This extraordinary 3-section Mammoth.
Yeah, it's a bit of a beast, this book. I always knew this was going to be an epic book, by the way, when I wrote it. So yeah, it was a bit daunting as a task, and that's as well as what happened with the book and actually not being able to get it published. I think I was really scared as well as to take this on because it was such a huge endeavor, and I was still a young writer at the time. I think at the time when I started that book, I was 28, 29. So yeah, it was massive. But at this point in the book, Marcus is having these spontaneous out of body experiences, and the technology is such in this alternative world that people don't actually do that anymore. Basically, what people do is there's a machine called a pod, a sleeper, or its official name is called the Osiris machine, and people sleep in them. They get into, instead of getting into bed, you get into pod, and you close the covering, and you have guided meditations, and basically the technology tells you where to go in the astral realm. It gives you good dreams, basically, and everybody in the community gets into these pods every night. But he's finding it more and more difficult to get into these pods, but also finding he keeps having spontaneous out of body experiences where he falls down. He's riding his bike, and it happens while he's riding his bike, and so he just falls onto the floor, or like that. He keeps having these deja vu like visions of things that are happening to him in other parallels or the future, or just time is just like always converging in on him. But he's 8 years old, he doesn't understand that. And so also in that scene later on, Willow takes him to the bottom of the garden, and it's 6 months. Every 6 months, the train taking poor people into the ark runs by the bottom of their garden. So she takes them there and they look at the train and they watch the train go, and she tells them, when you're old enough, you're going to get on that train, and you're going to go into the ark, and you're going to do it for our family. So that's basically the context of that scene.
And it's so different from your previous fiction, and you're liberated by speculative fiction, science fiction, alternative history to really run wild with your literary imagination. Um, what brought on that change? How was that? And then what do we look forward to next from you?
Yeah. So what brought about that change wasn't really it wasn't really brought about, like I'd always been doing it. And so I find it interesting now. I go back and my mum said when I started this book, she was like, "Oh God, you're writing science fiction at last. I always thought that was going to be the thing that you were going to do." But my attention got caught by the scholar telling those stories, social realism stories, crime fiction stories, which I'm also into, and I wrote those things first. It was kind of always in the plan that I was going to write sci-fi. I consider myself a genreless writer. I don't really stick to one thing. I like basically everything, and so I'm trying to try my hand at these various things, which again is almost like it's a sense of liberation in that as well. And what was your second question? Sorry.
Well, what are you going to do next?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I could go back to a social realist story that I've been wanting to tell for very, very many years, but I didn't feel like in the right headspace to be able to do that. I might do that. I might have another science fiction story to tell. One of my short stories, because this is being published January 7th, 2021, but I've also got a short story collection that's being published the same year by Canongate. And one of those stories I've developed into a novel, or I have the idea for the rest of it as a novel. So I might work on that. I've basically got about 10 or 11 ideas for various books um, kind of written up or waiting to go. So it's just a case of like just picking what I feel most willing to spend another 2 years of my life or maybe more working on. Uh,
What about a screenplay adaptation of A River Called Time, which is dying to be made into a Netflix series?
yeah, that would be something I'd be very much into. I mean, obviously, I don't know if people know, but I've just finished writing 2 episodes of Small Acts with Steve McQueen. So I'm very much into writing screenplays. I'm writing a feature now, we speak, which is a bit more grounded in reality as well. But I'm also writing like sci-fi shorts. Got a short that I'm developing now at the minute as well, which is very, very speculative too. So yeah, definitely that'd be something I'd want to do. It's just like, I'm lucky enough to have to worry about now when I'll have the time to do these things rather than if I can do them, which is a great place to be.
That's excellent. So no shortage of inspiration and no shortage of energy. Now it's shortage of time. So you've
Well,
reached that point as a writer where
shortage of energy, definitely.
okay,
Definitely with 2 kids and stuff. But yeah, I can always
yeah,
push myself to write. I mean, I love it. I love doing this job.
yeah. Well, you are full of zeal and full of fascinating insights on the world we live in, and on the nature of writing about it, and the nature of writing about an alternative world. And we wish you every success in anything you might turn your hand to soon. I really hope you dust off that screenplay you were telling me about that's in a bottom drawer at the moment, that will be particularly topical at the moment. But we can't reveal every secret of what's in the Courttia drawer. Thank you very much indeed for the time you spent with us. There will be links to buy your books at the bottom of this page, depending on how you're seeing us. Go to our website, lockdownlitfest.com, and that's where you will be. That's where you will best be able to find some buy links. The next novel comes out from Canongate in January 2021, and look forward to that. But meanwhile, get stuck into his other work and get stuck into the anthologies, including the IC3 anthology that's celebrating its 20th anniversary. So without further ado, Courttia, thank you very much indeed. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Palash.
Thank you, audience. All the best.